Salutations, Dave of the band System Degenerate here, giving you another SD lesson. This week I'm going to be talking about the importance of setting up a guitar rig, and all the things that can go wrong with it, and all the traps that you shouldn't be falling into, and all those other pessimistic things that go with my general bleak, pessimistic view of life. So I'm going to start off by basically saying what I'll be doing, which I just did, so I don't know why I'm saying that again. But this is all about what equipment to buy, how to set it up, how to get the best results out of it. So we'll start off with amplifiers. Now this isn't actually my stage amp, this is an amp that I've had for a few years. But what you need to do actually when you get your amplifier, there's two traps that you can fall into. One is the trap of spending a ridiculous amount of money. You actually don't have to spend a ridiculous amount of money to get something that's quality. This amp probably was quite expensive, I mean it was actually given to me, but you don't actually need to do that. Two, and again this is the reason I don't use this amp on stage, is you don't need a lot of output. I mean this is a 100-watt amplifier and it's incredibly heavy, and although it sounds good, I never usually have the master volume. If you look, I don't know, the focus of this camera might take a few seconds, there you go. You see how low down that master volume is, and that's basically how it always is. It's only slightly louder than that when I actually have used this thing on stage in the past. So you want to be looking more or less at a 40-watt amp. I mean that's something you can gig with, and you don't need to spend a huge amount of money for that. You can get something well under £200 that's actually going to be really good and playable. I recently bought myself a £140 Fender amp that is just awesome. Not that I'm actually plugging here, that I shouldn't really have plugged, never mind. Anyway, so we'll start off by talking about how to set this up. Now, if you look at the settings on this, I should actually point to the clean channel, you'll notice that I've cut the bass, I boosted the mids, and I've got a lot of treb. Now, a lot of people like to scoop the mids, which is basically what I have there, where you got more treb than bass, but you would turn the mids down, sort of somewhere like that. Now, the thing is, that might sound good on its own, although I don't personally like the sound of it on its own, I think it sounds pretty trashy. But when you're actually in a band situation, everything has its own frequency, and the guitars sort of have the mid frequencies covered. Vocals tend to be the high frequencies, bass is lower frequencies, drums are kind of a mixture of all of them. So generally you want to make sure that you hear everything within the right confines of that. So to explain it in a more clearer way, if someone's playing a guitar really high up on the neck and doing a solo and basically just being a shreddy show-off that everyone hates because he can't write songs, he'd rather just like write stuff that's really, really complicated and show off to compensate for that, he's going to be quite high up on the neck, he's going to have a lot of high end, and it's going to be easier to hear. Whereas someone who's playing the chuggy downturn riffs that can't write songs, he's just trying to compensate because he's playing chuggy downturn riffs, is going to actually be a lot harder to hear. So he's actually going to be louder in the mix, or she's going to be louder in the mix, I shouldn't be discriminating. So what you need to basically do is to make sure you got plenty of mid, and you want to make sure you got plenty of treb, but not too much treb, because again, too much treb can actually sound really tinny and watery. So a good amount of both those things, and not too much bass, because then you're just going to bury yourself in the mix, and you don't want to do that when you're a guitarist. You want to show off, because why else would you be a guitarist unless you weren't a show-off. Same with gain. Too much gain sounds terrible. I mean this is the clean channel there, so there's not a lot on it anyway, and most of my actual distortion comes from a distortion pedal. Moving on to the pedals, you have the option of using stomp boxes like I've got here, or a multi-effector, whichever one is up to you. You know, it's all good. I personally find these are a little bit easier to customize because you got all the little fancy knobs and everything like that. So you know, you can do that, you can have a bit more variety in where you lay them out and all that kind of stuff. Also, stomp box distortions sound different from the distortions that are running through the amp. If you're using your amp's overdrive channel, you're going to have a much warmer sound, and it's going to be a lot deeper. And in the case of some amps that haven't been built for metal, the overdrive channel is literally an overdrive channel. So you might want to boost it up with an actual overdrive pedal there, which you can feed into the amp's distortion if that's the way you want to go. But you will get more excess noise, and it won't sound the same. It's all down to preference. If you want a warmer distortion sound, use the amp. If you want something that's a bit more brutal, you use the pedals. That's what I've got here. Also, if you're going to get a noise gate, make sure you hook it up properly. I mean, a quick description of that, you've got the 2 inputs and 2 outputs. So you want your signal from the guitar to go into the input, and then you want to send output into any pedals that you have that actually make the excess noise that you actually want the gate to work on, which will then have an output that goes into the return, And then the output from the actual pedal can either go to any time-related pedals that you have, or they can go straight into the amp. But just make sure you've got the return in use there, from the output, the distortion pedal, and send is going in, and then everything's coming out of the actual noise suppressor. That way it will actually work as a noise suppressor and not just sound horrible all the time. Now, I've actually set this thing with quite a lot of treb. The pedal I haven't so much. But the thing to bear in mind as well is that the guitar I'm using has got a ashwood body, which basically means it's got a much brighter sound anyway. And that's something that likes to cut through the mix. Most people prefer mahogany because it has a more general all-purpose sound. I prefer ashwood because I like to be heard. I'm a show-off in that respect. So these are all things to take into account. You need to be thinking about what kind of wood is the guitar made out of. You need to be thinking about what kind of pickups has it got. I prefer humbuckers. You need to be thinking about what settings you're going to be using, and whether or not you can hook these things up right. You need to be thinking about whether or not you have stump box or you want to use the multi-effectors. And really, it's just a matter of playing around with what you think sounds good. But stump box is if you just want a distortion and switch between distortion and a clean, you just want a distortion pedal. And that's it. I mean, I only really use two effects. I have my distortion and I have my chorus. Everything else, that's just kind of making sure the distortion doesn't go too crazy. And the overdrive is really just to boost up the distortion on the amp if I choose to go that way, but I seldom do. In fact, I'm actually going to replace that with a pedal tuner once I get some money to do so. So, yeah, the other thing is going back to what I said earlier about money, and that's that you will notice a certain price difference if you're paying for things like, if you buy like a £20 distortion pedal, it's not going to sound as good as the one that's £50, but you don't have to spend £150 on a good distortion pedal. In fact, one of the most commonly used distortion pedals in the world is the Boss DS1, of which I used to have but I don't have anymore, and that is actually only £40, and that literally goes for loads and loads of people who've been using it. It's a really, really well known, well respected pedal, so that's all good stuff. And as for the guitar itself, a lot of the time what you're paying for when you pay for a £1,000 nice high-end expensive guitar is the fact that it was hand-built in an American factory, or a Japanese factory if the company in question are Japanese. Factory-built guitars that were made outside of America, or in one of the other countries where it's actually cheaper to manufacture them, can often be built to the exact same specs as a high-end guitar, but will be a lot cheaper. And you'll find that they can be just as good and they will last you just as long. Just don't expect them to have any collector's value, but if you're looking to be up and play on stage, then that's all you really need. I mean, that guitar cost me £370, but it's worth about £600 had it been made by one of the bigger manufacturers. Personally, I love this guitar. It's probably my favourite guitar. I have dubbed her Faith. After the bucket character, obviously. The other thing to bear in mind as well is strap locks. Now I'm using you can't really see on this camera, but I'm using the cheap little plastic ones because I am a cheapskate, but you want to get some good quality ones really. The important thing though is just to have them, because you don't want that thing breaking off. You really don't. I mean, if you do spend a lot of money on a nice guitar, you're going to want to protect it. Same with stomp boxes. Don't buy plastic. Plastic will break. So that's pretty much the basics of it. In terms of what equipment to buy, how to get good tone, things like that. Hopefully this helped, and I will see you for next week's lesson.